Hello and welcome to the RC and FPV Q&A session number 9. Turns out that we are doing this for more than a year. Well, look how the time flies, and for today I have a nice set of questions prepared by my YouTube and Patreon supporters. So, without further ado, let's start answering. Pete asks, is it still possible to use SimonK with current INAV or my 450 size quad? I already have to replace the flight controller and would like to reuse the ESCs. Yes, absolutely, no problem. If the SimonK support one-shot 125, and I think they should support the one-shot 125, use the one-shot 125 ESC protocol. If not, then start with the standard protocol. INAV should communicate with the ESCs without absolutely any problem, and everything should be working just fine. The next question is from Matt Miller. How to choose a right motor by determining the grams of thrust of the motor and how much grams of thrust need for the weight of my specific quad. The rule of thumb that as little of the thrust you should go is to have combined thrust at least twice the weight of your build. So if you are, for example, building something that will weigh 500 grams, you have to have at least 1,000 grams of thrust to be able to fly. Not to do any interesting flippity floppy or just be fast or efficient or whatever, just to be able to fly, because you need this extra thrust from the motors for not only for carrying the weight but also for the stabilization. So total twice the weight. However, this really depends on the application in which you want to fly your thing. Because in general, it's not only, like I said just before, it's not only about keeping in the air, but also having enough of the power in the motors to quickly stabilize your airframe so you have a nice flight to be able to do the punch outs, to do roll spins, whatever you really just want to do. And remember that modern racers have just absurdly high thrust to weight ratio. Like you can weigh 500 grams and have 4 kilograms of the thrust available. However, this really depends on the application. Do not go below twice, do not go below twice the weight, but besides that, the sky is the limit. And so do not go below twice the weight of your flying contraption, but basically the sky is the limit. And as long as you can fight component, it's usually simpler to lower the throttle scaling than to fight with not just powerful enough of the drone. Miguel asks, how do I choose a capacitor for the quad build? First, go with the low ESR capacitor. Low ESR means it has a low internal resistance, inline resistance equivalent. That means it can charge and discharge with a relatively high current quickly. If you do not have the low ESR capacitor, then the efficiency of the capacitor will be slightly limited. Then voltage. Rule of thumb, go twice as high as the voltage you are using on your battery, because there will be voltage spikes and the capacitor has to be capable of surviving the voltage spikes. So for the 4S setups, the 35 volts low ESRs are fine. For 6S and higher, well, 40 something, 48, maybe even going up to 60 volts is really a good thing, because if the voltage of the capacitor will be too low, that means it's not designed to handle the high voltage, it might just explode. And finally, the capacity. Here, basically you are only limited by the size you can sacrifice in your frame for the capacitor. Rule of thumb, do not go below 350 microfarads. Find just something that is small enough you can fit it, that is just higher capacity than the 350. And there is no upper limit. You can go 500, 600, 1000. You only have to have space on your build to fit the big capacitor and of course enough of the power to lift the big capacitor. But do not go below 350 microfarads and basically you should be golden. Francesco asks, which quads you'd suggest in a portfolio? Which size for the long range, which for cine, etc.? I cannot really recommend any bind and fly quads right now. There's just too much of that. I'm not really into the topic. However, it's mostly for the size of the propeller that you want and you have to fight with. If you are just into the freestyle, then basically 5 inches are the best for the freestyle and the racing. Yes, if you really want to, you can do this with the smaller ones. If you are really like to, you can do a freestyle with the 7 inches. I love doing freestyle with the 7 inches. However, well, it has some problems. On the topics of the, how you said it, long range, usually the bigger propeller is better. So long range really starts with the 7 inches and then goes basically to how much you are willing to sacrifice for the efficiency of the propeller. However, in my opinion, the simplicity of the build kinda ends with the 7 inches. So if you do not want to fight with too much of the problems and too much of the prices of the props, of the motors and so on, kinda stick with the 7 inches. And for cine, this one more time depends on the weight of the payload you want to carry. Because if you only want to carry, well, let's say, I don't know, a GoPro, then even 5 inches is enough. If you want to carry a light, better camera, that it's still not super heavy, then the 7 inches should work just fine. If, however, you would like to put something like a gimbal on this thing, which adds extra weight, then kinda you have to go 8 or even 9 inches. It's really all depends on your need and the particular case you have to solve with your drone. There is not one answer to that. Daniel asks, I have a Flywoo Explorer which is too small and compact to get a reliable compass readings. No, it's not. It's only how you're gonna place the magnetometer on your frame. Usually between rear motors is more than enough. I have the Diaton Roma F4LR, which is basically exactly the same size, and the magnetometer works just like that, absolutely no problem. So it's only about the way how you're gonna position the GPS and the magnetometer. But the second part of the question is, will INAV have the return to home without the compass? I think I'm answering this question every Q&A session. Right now we are not planning anything like that. However, if any independent developer would like to step in and implement something like that, we kinda would have absolutely nothing against merging this thing into our repository. Frank asks, why don't we have listen before talk on the VTXes? On analog, there is not really a possibility to do the listen before talk because analog just transmit whenever there is something to transmit. All the analog systems that we use just transmit with the specific band on the specific frequency, no matter what's happening. It's only a transmitter and not even the receiver. So the transmitter has no idea if something else is transmitting. If it's so, it has no way to change to a different channel or just negotiate something. But the digital DJI most probably is doing listen before talk. Probably, I don't know the implementation details, but if they are certified for the European Union, they kinda have to do the listen before talk. No idea about the HD0 as well, but with digital, it's possible. If only someone decides, okay, let's do it with the digital, then yeah, if you have the frequency hopping and stuff like that, the spread spectrum talk between the transmitter and the receiver, and the transmitter is also capable of receiving something, it's doable. Only someone has to do it, but not really possible with the analog, because this just would not work. NZL Sub-Zero asks, is it necessary to have sponge foam over the barometer on the FC? No, it's not necessary, but it helps a lot. It all depends how well the barometer is placed, how resistant to the gusts of the winds and the changing pressure around it is, and generally how much of the baro drift and when you, for example, throttle up, you have. Rule of thumb, yes, add the foam over the baro because it never breaks anything but helps a lot. So by default, add it. If, however, you think that you don't need it, check if you really don't need it, because it's kind of a simple procedure. Just go somewhere, fly, observe the altitude readings, and even without the foam, the baro readings are fine, then you are golden. The second question from NZL Sub-Zero is something I'm also answering very often. Will INAV implement motor remap like Betaflight do? And the short answer is, well, rather not. Sorry, this is just the reality. I have and I will have more videos only on this topic later. Audio Geek asks, if the DJI was able to bump the image quality by introducing 50 megabit mode, why the analog signal is not, well, they never did exactly the same thing with the analog and just double the bandwidth on the analog. Is there a physics just preventing things from happening? Exactly, this is the case. You just, on the transmission line, you do not have enough of the bandwidth to put more information. You could use the spare bandwidth, for example, to add more information about the color, to add higher resolution, to add the higher frame rate, and so on and so on. But there is just physics blocking the analog signal, how fast you can reliably modulate it and demodulate it, to be able to pull this thing off. And then think about it like that. While increasing the frame rate twice, you only have to increase the bandwidth twice. However, when you increase the resolution twice, you have to send 4 times more the information. And the reality is just the analog video with the PAL resolution is top that we can put on the wire and just use it as we use it. And also, please do remember that the analog, well, it's kind of obsolete. Everybody went digital years ago, and we were using analog only because it was cheaper, not it was better. Everybody else went digital. Just look at the television, cameras, everything. We only stayed for analog that long because it was cheap and easily available. The next question is from Ben. And Ben, after migrating on his quad from Betaflight to INAV, noticed that his motors are getting hot. Luckily, I have a specific video on this topic that I just published a few weeks ago, so the link is in the description, so go there, check for the details. But basically, this means that probably either your D-term LPF is too low, or the D-term gains are too high, or just you have misset the filter on the gyro and too much of the noise captured by the gyro is fed to the motor because of the D-term. Adjusting that should fix everything, but all the details are in that video. Ignition FPV asks, converting Sicario from Betaflight to INAV, and from time to time the motors are not starting, random motors. This looks like the problem with the DMA, to be honest. I would first of all disable the analog to digital converters and then disable the LED strip if you have it enabled. Check if it's happening with the D-Shot. If you still have this problem, then switch from D-Shot to multi-shot. The drone will fly exactly the same, no matter if it's multi-shot or D-Shot. And then just find out what's really going on, which additional function causes the problem. I never tested the flight controller you use, which is the Matek F722 HD with the Octa configuration, but I think it should be possible, and most probably this is just a conflict between the D-Shot and the ADC or the LED strip. If you have not created a pull issue on the GitHub to let developers know about this problem, please do. This kind of usually helps in resolving these kinds of the problems. Jim Dyke asks, will INAV ever have a native camera shutter trigger for basic mapping mission based on the image overlap with future prospect for geotagging images? Perhaps rather not, because INAV is not currently the software designed for this professional and semi-professional usage. If you want to use it, probably you will be better with ArduPilot. However, you can have automatic camera trigger that will trigger on the waypoint or executed every specific amount of time or specific amount of travel distance. This can be made with the programming framework and the logic conditions, and one day probably I will just have to make the video how to set it up. It's possible, so that you will get constantly trigger of the shutter of the camera based on the time or the distance, but you will have to figure out the details by yourself. Dank RC asks, in older versions of INAV you used to be able to set GPS mode loiter, then auto launch, and the plane would loiter at the top of the auto launch climb. This doesn't seem possible to do anymore with INAV 3.0 or later. Am I missing something? I don't think it was ever really possible. You would not be able to throw with position hold enabled, so perhaps it was a bug if this was available for a short period of time, but it should not be possible. There should be not such a functionality as long as I am aware. Might be wrong, but I don't think so. Probably right now the current situation is the expected situation. If you would like this to change, please create the issue on the GitHub. Let developers know that you would like to have something like that, and maybe someone else faced the same problem that you had and have the solution. You might never know. Gita asks, when will we have sliding bars from PID tuning, like in Betaflight 4.3, or when I will make the PID tuning video for INAV? So, first part of the question, sliders. I'm not the biggest fan of the sliders, and especially the simplified tuning in Betaflight, because it makes you forget about the real gains. It's just the additional layer of abstraction on top of the PID and feed forward. This is why I'm not really sure that this is the correct way. It might seem simpler, but it's not really simpler, because you still have to understand how the PID controller is working, but you also have to know the translation layer between the sliders to the real gains on the PID controller. However, I'm thinking about, let's say, improving the user interface and introducing some sliders for quite some time now, but without the simplified PID tuning from the Betaflight. On the topic of the PID tuning videos, I have already a few on the topic, and don't worry, before or actually after the INAV 5 is out, I intend to record a whole set of the new videos, how to tune, how to set up both quads and airplanes. Pavel, but a different one, asks, how INAV use Lidar to determine height? I know that barometer and GPS are used together and height is calculated from two inputs all the time. If we add Lidar, does it override calculated height, or is it more precise? The altitude over ground is treated separately. The altitude you see in the OSD, even if you have Lidar enabled, does not come from the Lidar at all. Because Lidar does not participate in the current relative altitude computation, which is the altitude over the place where you took off, not currently to the ground. Whenever INAV requires to use over the ground altitude, for example using the surface mode, it just switches internally to the Lidar source and ignores the relative altitude reported by the GPS barometer and to some extent also by the accelerometer. So those are internally two completely different altitudes used for completely different things. David Gardner asks, is there a way to get extra serial port on the Matek F411 SE? No, this is all you have, this is all you got. You will not get any additional serial port on this board, besides the options that you have. That means 2 hardware serials and 2 software serials. Period. You will never get anything like that. Do remember that this is the smallest, the cheapest and the least powerful flight controllers that we are using right now, the whole 411 series. And expecting to have more serial ports on that, I think it's just, well, you just expect too much. And that's the end of this RC and FPV Q&A session. By the way, here's the next video you should watch, because it's amazing. I'm Paweł Spychalski, thank you very much for watching, and like always, happy flying!